Okay, we're back to Proclus with his commentary on the Timaeus, and we'll just pick up right where we left off. Here's the quote. The former of these, indeed, is comprehended by intelligence in conjunction with reason, since it always subsists with invariable sameness, but the latter is perceived by opinion in conjunction with irrational sense, since it is generated and corrupted and never truly is. Okay, we have that basic division between beings and things which subsist in becoming to be. And go ahead and go to Proclus. To these it happens that they err in many other respects, and that they comprehend in the definitions the things defined. Okay. I see what happened. Yeah, so footnote says the beginning of the commentary is wanting. So we have a lacuna in the text. So I'm not sure what he's talking about. That they comprehend in the definitions the thing defined. So obviously that's a bad way to make a definition. You can't use the word you're trying to define in a definition. But what that definition was, we don't know. For what perpetual being is, which the first definition assumes is explained and is said to be that which always subsists with invariable sameness, and this the second definition assumes, saying it is that which is generated and corrupted but never truly is. This, however, is to accuse both themselves and Plato of unskillfulness in dialectic. But others dividing the sentence show that in each of the colons there are definition and the thing defined. Or colons. I'm not sure the sense of colon. Usually that's a punctuation mark. I don't know. Is there another definition? Mid-16th century as a term in rhetoric denoting a section of a complete sentence or a pause before it. So basically clause then. Colon. I didn't realize colon had that archaic meaning. Okay, so show that in each of the clauses there are definition and the thing defined. For in the former clause, the words, quote, that which is comprehended by intelligence in conjunction with reason are a definition, but the words, since it always subsists with invariable sameness, are the thing defined. And in the second colon, clause, the words is perceived by opinion in conjunction with irrational sense are given as a definition, but the remaining part of the sentence is the thing defined. So somebody probably objected that he's using the thing to be defined in the definition, but one clause of the sentence is the definition, the other clause is not part of the definition. To these men, it will be found our preceptor has well replied. So he's talking about Syrianus. For by a little transposition of the words, the whole will be immediately apparent as follows. That which always subsists with invariable sameness is comprehended by intelligence in conjunction with reason. But that which is generated and corrupted and never truly is perceived by opinion in conjunction with irrational sense. For these things are consequent to what was before said. To adjust the screen capture, one moment. Okay. For these things are consequent to what was before said, quote, what is that which is always being, but is without generation? And, quote, what is that which is generated, but is never real being? That which always subsists with invariable sameness, signifying the same thing as that which is without generation, and that which is generated but is never real being, having the same signification as that which never truly is, though they are more obscurely announced. And through the addition of truly, Plato indicates that so far indeed as it is generated, it is not, but that so far as it brings with it an image of being, so far it is not generated. For in the definitions, he renders the things defined more clear through the additions. Thus, one of the definitions says, which is always being, in order that by the term always we may not understand temporal perpetuity, but the eternal. For this is all at once, and subsists with invariable sameness. But temporal perpetuity is coextended with the infinity of time. Thus, too, the other definition has that which is generated, and together with it also says, and is corrupted. In order that we may not understand by generations simply progressions, which are also ascribed to the gods who are beyond being, but progressions which are coordinate with destruction. So yeah, all things abide, proceed, and revert atemporally. So the gods have progressions, emanations, but they're not coordinate with destruction. They're not in the realm of generation. The assigned definitions, therefore, are such as follow. Perpetual being is that which is comprehended by intelligence in conjunction with reason. That which is generated is perceived by opinion in conjunction with irrational sense. So these definitions, I don't know if we could call them proper definitions. He does not assume the genus. Yet Proclus is just about to say. Instead, we're like getting definitions by the faculties which encompass them. So that would, I think there's a term for this. It's enough to single out the thing in question, but it's not a proper definition. Aristotle uses this concept in the categories. You can't have definitions of the various categories because there's no common genus to which they belong. So it's impossible to define the 10 categories, but we do have something about them, and I'm forgetting the term, where it's not quite a definition, but it does like point to one thing as opposed to another. That's all right. Let's go to Proclus here. For these definitions, however, it is usual to accuse Plato in the first place, indeed, that he does not assume genus, as the rules of definitions require. In the next place, that he does not manifest what the nature is of the things defined, but distinguishes them by our knowledge. It is necessary, however, prior to this habitude, to consider things themselves by themselves. So, in line with the criticisms of Plato, as far as these aren't true definitions, which I'm sympathetic to currently, but in defense of Plato, we shall demonstrate the very contrary, viz., that those who are accustomed thus to doubt perfectly err. For what kind of genus has a place in being, which comprehends every intelligible essence? For if essence has no genus prior to itself, nor definition, since it is most generic, what can you say respecting being which is comprehensive of every essence and of all powers and energies? Neither, therefore, is being the genus of eternal being, for if it was, it would not be simply being, but a certain being. Eternal being simply, but if it partook of the genus of being, then it would be one specific being among others. Nor is non-being the genus of eternal being, lest we should ignorantly make eternal lest we should ignorantly make eternal non-being. For everywhere genera are predicated of species, hence there is not a genus of being, right? Which Aristotle also agrees with, but then, like Aristotle says, that means we can't have definitions of the categories. So it's a similar problem that we're dealing with here, but Proclus wants to count these as proper definitions, even though there's no genus. Besides, is not a definition derived from knowledge adapted to theory and to the proposed definitions? For if, as we said before, Plato wished to use these axioms and hypotheses in the demonstrations which he intended to make, it was necessary that they should be known and manifest to us. Okay. So, kind of ignoring the usual requirements for a definition, instead, given the limitations of the entities in question, that there's no genus of being, instead we're going to define it by what is salient or knowable about it to us. Karnik, if you remember that term that I'm trying to think of, where like there's a notion of each of the categories, but not a definition strictly speaking, a similar kind of term might be helpful for Proclus here.
I'll see what I can dig up.
Okay, cool. Plato wished to use these axioms, so it was necessary they should be known and manifest to us. So defining them by our epistemological faculties and what they grasp means it's, a salient, clear definition for our purposes. If indeed he had exhorted us to investigate the nature of things itself in itself, he would have ignorantly filled the whole of his doctrine definitions with obscurity. I think there's an error in this sentence. But anyway, if he had asked us to look at the things themselves in themselves as opposed to the way that we know them, then the further arguments based on these pseudo definitions would be obscure. But as he wished to make known through definitions being and that which is generated, he produced the demonstrations through things that are known, and clearly represents to us the peculiarity of them, in order that being excited and perfected, we may more manifestly survey what each of them is. For since everything Gnostic is either the thing known itself, or perceives, or possesses the thing known, for intellect, indeed, is the intelligible, but sense perceives what is sensible, and dianoia possesses in itself the dianoetic object. And as we are not naturally adapted to become the intelligible, but know it through the power in us, which is conjoined with it, this being the case, we require this power, and through this the nature of being is known to us. After this manner, therefore, we answer the doubts. Okay, so the reason it would be improper to ask us to grasp the nature of eternal being in itself is that transcends our level of being as souls. And so we have to define what is beyond insofar as we have faculties in ourselves as souls to grasp them. So we don't have pure being in our mind. We have our epistemological access to it. So since that's what we have to work with, that's where the definitions have to come from. Again, though, I think it would not be proper to call those definitions. All right. So it's something like the idea of a notion as opposed to a definition.
Right.
It might start with a P. It's going to bother me that I'm not remembering. That's all right. It is requisite, however, to observe how Plato, proposing to himself the problems, renders each of them manifest, both affirmatively and negatively. But giving an answer to each, in perpetual being, indeed, he assumes the affirmative alone, but in that which is generated, the negative, adding to it also, and which is destroyed. He also explains the words, but which is never being, through the assumption of never truly is. For since being is characterized by existence alone, but that which is generated by non-existence, he assumes the one alone defining it, and says subsisting invariably the same. But he assumes the other together with negation, yet not with negation alone, because definitions respect affirmations and signify that which in each thing is inherent. It is not, however, wonderful if he not only says which is generated, but also and corrupted, for as he adds to being the words subsisting with invariable sameness, and not only says it is always, so likewise to that which is generated, he adds and corrupted. For this, so far as it is generated, is different from perpetual being. But so far as it is corrupted, it differs from that which is invariably the same. Okay. For that which is generated, so far as it is generated and corrupted, is incapable of connecting itself, since if it were, it would also be able to produce itself. Assuming, therefore, each by itself, i.e., being and that which is generated, he assumes the former as that which is above generation, but the latter as that which is not indestructible, so that when the representation of being accedes to that which is generated, it is able after a certain manner to abide in a condition of always becoming to be. Okay. Let us, however, consider each of the words by itself through which he composes the propositions. And in the first place, let us see in how many ways intelligible subsists, and collect by a reasoning process the other progressions of it. The first intelligence, therefore, is the intelligible, which passes into the same with the intelligible, and is not anything different from it. So the primary intelligence is the intelligible entities themselves. So that's the intelligence subsisting in intelligibles and is non-different from those intelligibles. So like the forms themselves, the form of beauty itself is not just an inert object of knowledge as an intelligible. It also has an innate intelligence, which kind of grasps itself. So that's the primary form of intelligence. And that would be like the intelligibles phase of the second hypostasis. This also is essential intelligence and essence itself, because everything in the intelligible subsists after this manner, viz. Essentially and intelligibly. And, what is produced from higher natures subsists in those higher natures seminally, of course. So intellect proceeds from and reverts to intelligibles. Therefore, intellect subsists in intelligibles intelligibly. And on the contrary, in intellectual things, or rather intelligible things subsist in intellectual things intellectually. Right, so the producing cause contains its effects seminally according to its own proper level of being. The effects that are created contain their cause according to their own level. So just to rearticulate that, intelligibles contain intellectual nature intelligibly, and intellectuals contain intelligible nature intellectually. I hope I said that correct. All right, the second intelligence is that which conjoins intellect with the intelligible, possessing a peculiarity which is connective and collective of the extremes, and existing as life and power, filling indeed intellect from the intelligible, but establishing it in the intelligible. So this is the second phase of the second hypostasis. Of course, we have being, life, intellect is one way to name these three phases. The other is intelligible, intelligible and intellectual, and then intellectual as the third phase. So second phase is intelligible and intellectual. Let's just read this again. The second intelligence is that which conjoins intellect with the intelligible. And then there's a general rule for, Platonists where when you have a spectrum with A and B on two ends, A plus B is going to be a middle term, A and B. So some things will be A, some things will be B, some things will be A and B. And that's universal. The second, let's see, that should see. Oh, perfect. Yeah, Karnak came up with that term, propria. So appropriate, let's get a definition of appropriate to see if it would be appropriate here. Appropriate. Aristotle. Propria are non-essential properties which flow from the essence of a kind, such that they are necessary to that kind even without being essential. Okay, this might not be... I think it was used of the individual categories, but then it seems like this has another use as well.
Yeah, he said that he can't give definitions, so he gives only examples and propria, and seems to say that propria in a strict sense are properties of all and only members of a kind.
Yeah. A property that is shared in a kind without necessarily being essential. So that means you're not giving the genus, but you're giving a property that all the things share in. That could apply to the categories where all position has this in common, but it's not a genus above it that renders it in common. Or you could have propria of classes of mundane entities that all share in the same property accidentally rather than essentially. So propria could be used of things beyond genus, or it could be used of things which share in common properties accidentally rather than essentially. Okay, glad we got that in there. And then the second intelligence, let's start here again, is that which conjoins intellect with the intelligible. So obviously, intelligible is the first phase, intellect is the third phase. The second intelligence is that middle term that joins them, possessing a peculiarity which is connective and collective of the extremes. That's what defines the middle, that which joins the extremes, and existing as life and power, being life, intellect, filling indeed intellect from the intelligible. So that's the procession phase. Intellect gets its more differentiated contents from the procession of the intelligible, and that procession takes place through this life, or the intelligible and intellectual, but establishing it in the intelligible. So filling intellect from the intelligible, but establishing it in the intelligible, meaning the intellect in its reversion back to the intelligible goes through this middle term, and so the middle term establishes it also at the end of the day back in the intelligible. The third is the conjoined intelligence of a divine intellect itself. So that's intellect, strictly speaking, being the energy of intellect through which it comprehends the intelligible it contains, and according to which it intellectually perceives and is what it is. For this intelligence is energy and intelligence itself, but is not intelligible intelligence. So you might say intellect is intelligence itself of intellect, because it is like what we know is that active faculty. Lower orders, of course, the demiurge is an intellect, not an intelligible. And so our orders of being, soul, and cosmos are generated from intellect. And so what intellectual things we participate in are mediated by intellect, not the intelligibles directly. So for this intelligence, intellect is energy. It kind of makes sense, basically, where the intelligibles are like the essences, and then intellect is more like their energies interpreted a certain way. And intelligence itself, but is not intelligible intelligence. Yeah. So, I mean, that kind of comports with our intuitions about the forms, where the forms aren't primarily intelligent, they are primarily intelligible. And yet, because they contain the seeds of intelligence, they contain intellect in a certain manner. They contain intellect intelligibly, but not in the manner of intelligence, strictly speaking. So intelligence itself, as that active power, is proper to intellect, the third phase. Nor does it exist as power, but as we have seen, as energy and intellectual essence, intellectual intelligence. So nor does intellect exist as power dunamis or potential, but as we have said, as energy or activity. So it's not the third phase, this third type of intelligence is intellect itself in the second hypostasis, and there it doesn't exist as a capacity. Like we have intellect at the level of a faculty or capacity or power that is not fully actualized, whereas in the second hypostasis, intellect is fully actualized. That's going to, kind of map onto Aristotelian and ultimately Thomistic ideas of pure activity. That's proper to intellect, because intellect, by analogy to its relation to intelligibles, is like the energy to the intelligible's essence. The intelligence of partial intellects has the fourth order. So we have intellect itself as that third, and now partial intellects are the fourth kind of intelligence. For each of these possesses this. Okay, footnote's not helpful. For each of these partial intellects possesses intelligence and entirely contains in itself a certain conjoined intelligible and intelligence. All right, so the partial intellects contain, by participation, certain intelligibles, certain intelligence, or rather, each has all these partially, viz., intellect, intelligence, and the intelligible, through which also it is conjoined to total intellects, intellectually perceives each of these, and likewise the whole intelligible world. Okay, so we contain partial intellects, and these partial intellects have the koinai noi in them, so the basic archetypes that are kind of reflections of those higher archetypes, the intelligibles. Okay, or rather, each has all these partially, so it has intellect, intelligence, and the intelligible. The whole second hypostasis in all three phases is there, contained intellectually and partially in partial intellects, through which also it is conjoined to total intellects, intellectually perceives each of these, and likewise the whole intelligible world. The fifth intelligence is that of the rational soul. So now we're dipping below the intellect, strictly speaking, or nous in us. We're talking now about dia-noetic activity. Dia meaning through, nous meaning mind. So mind is like the intelligible essences and intellect, properly speaking, and then the dianoia through nous is like discursive reason. It's moving between these kind of axiomatic, fixed, intuitive, intellectual notions. The fifth intelligence is that of the rational soul, for as the rational soul is called intellect, thus also the knowledge of it is intelligence and transitive intelligence, and has time connascent with itself. So the origin of time is in the rational soul. The rational soul is that which first measures time for Proclus. But the sixth intelligence, if you are willing also to co-numerate this, is fantastic knowledge. So the faculty of the fantasy, or the knowledge of the imagination. Fantasia, or phantasia. The knowledge of the imagination, which by some is denominated intelligence. Aristotle calls imagination the passive intellect, as opposed to nous, properly speaking, which is the active intellect. And the fantasy is called by them passive. Well, yeah, there you go. Called by them passive intellect, because it knows such things as it does know inwardly and accompanied with resemblances and figures. So impressions are made onto the imagination. It knows things inwardly. It's not like the intellect, which kind of goes out beyond itself to make contact with it, the archetypes, the intelligibles, Instead, imagination is imprinted upon and has resemblances and figures of real things in itself. For it is common to all intelligence to have the objects of its knowledge inward. So it is intelligence insofar as it's an inward, self-reverting kind of motion. Maybe I was kind of misguided there to say intellect is more outgoing. You could say it is because it connects, it leads us back to the intelligibles, but those intelligibles are still contained in intellect insofar as we come to know them, so it's still a kind of self-revertive activity. But again, qualify that because if you revert to yourself, but in yourself there are the traces of your cause, then at the same time self-reversion is an ascending to your causes prior to yourself. So if intellect, in reverting to itself, to the traces of the intelligibles in itself, is self-revertive, it's also kind of reaching up beyond to the cause of itself in the intelligibles, properly speaking. Whereas imagination doesn't necessarily reach upward in the same way. It is self-revertive and knows in its own domain, but maybe not as actively. So that's why it's the passive intellect. For in this also, intelligence differs from sense. Sense obviously is outgoing. Imagination is inward rather than sense, which is outward. It is common to all intelligence to have the objects of its knowledge inward. For in this also, intelligence differs from sense. In one order, however, intelligence is the thing known itself. In another, it ranks as the second, but sees that which is first totally. In another, it is partially the thing known, but sees wholes as through that which is partial. In another, it sees indeed wholes, but at the same time partially and not at once. And in another, the vision is accompanied with passion. So many, therefore, are the differences of intelligence. Vision accompanied with passion. So we had 6 categories in all. To rehearse that, so the 6 categories would be intelligibles, intelligible and intellectuals, intellectual or intellect properly speaking, then partial intellects, then dianoia, and then fantasy. Now, however, fantastic intelligence must not be assumed, since this is not naturally adapted to no truly existing being. For it is indefinite, because it knows the object of its perception accompanied with figure and morphe. But perpetual being is unfigured, and in short, so when Plato in this, propria that he gives of eternal beings mentions intelligence there, he's obviously not talking about the passive intellect. Perpetual being is unfigured. And in short, no irrational knowledge is able to survey being itself, since neither is adapted to perceive that which is universal. Nor must the intelligence in the rational soul be assumed, for it does not possess the at once collected, and that which is coordinate with eternal natures, but it proceeds according to time. Nor must we assume total intellections, for these are exempt from our knowledge. Total intellect transcends us, we have partial intellect. But Timaeus co-arranges intelligence with reason. The intelligence, therefore, of a partial intellect must now be assumed. So, in a similar way, we designate partial intellect as that which is denominated because he mentions intelligence and reason. So, in the same way that the second phase of the second hypostasis is like intelligible and intellectual, here we have what is intelligent and rational together, and that's in the rational soul. If it was just the total intellect, it would just be intellect, no reason, but reason is the next level beneath, and so we have intelligent and rational, which equates to that same category of the partial intellect. The intelligence, therefore, of a partial intellect must now be assumed. For it is in conjunction with this that we sometime or other perceive real being. For as sense is in the second dyad below the rational soul, so intelligence is in the dyad above. So I don't know where this dyad term is coming from. Oh, I think it's, if we're talking about the divided line, maybe. So we have the two categories above. Sense is in the second category, opinion and sense. So the divided line, we have nous steinoia, opinion and sense. Sense is in the second dyad below the rational soul. And then so intelligence is in the dyad above the rational soul. The rational soul is sort of the midpoint of the divided line. So intelligence is in that higher division. Fine. For a partial intellect is proximately established above our essence. Right. Our partial intellect is right above the level of our soul. Our soul is our essence as human beings. And the partial intellect that we participate of is immediately above our essence, elevating and perfecting our essence if we make contact with it, to which we are converted when purified through philosophy, and when we conjoin our own intellectual power with the intelligence of this intellect. So our own native intellectual power, the rational intellectual power, that is amplified when it's coordinate with the partial intellect that we participate of. But what this partial intellect is, and that it is not as one-to-one rational soul, but is participated through souls which always energize according to it, through which also partial souls sometimes participate of intellectual light, we have elsewhere distinctly and copiously discussed. So he's saying it's not a one-to-one ratio of partial intellects to rational souls. Instead, that for each partial intellect, there are a multitude of souls, and even some partial souls that will participate in it. Now, however, partial souls would be daimons. Some orders of daimons are partial, not whole souls, so they don't have the same kind of necessary essence. They're sort of shades of real beings, and a lot of the kind of nefarious daimonical forces would be partial souls, not true souls. In all the orders of being, of course, we go from that which is more whole and complete to that which is more partial. So even, I think Proclus says, in the henads themselves, the unities in the first hypostasis, you go from the real henads, the whole henads, down to partial henads. Same with the intellect. And this is a good way, actually, of accounting for false mathematical propositions. Where do falsehoods subsist? Well, they have some real being. If they're total non-entities, then we can't say anything about them. And yet falsehoods have properties, so they're real in some sense, although not totally true. Well, these partial soul natures, partial dianoetic natures, can be not holistically connected. So a falsehood is not holistically connected. It's it's lacking something, some connection that self-defines it. It departs from real being in some regard. Whereas the true dianoetic entities are a true equation. It's just there for all eternity, self-subsistent. But yeah, having these partial souls, partial intellects, partial members of these grades allows, I think, accounting for falsehood. Which isn't the way Plato tackles it directly in the Sophist, but I think it is sort of implying the same general ontological solution, the way that Plato treats it. Now, however, thus much must be assumed that it is participated indeed by all other proximate daimonical souls. Okay, so the partial intellect is participated by all other proximate daimonical souls, but illuminates ours when we convert ourselves to it and render the reason which is in us intellectual. So our partial intellect doesn't perpetually illuminate our intelligence, our rational intelligence. It does that occasionally, and it takes special measures to bring that about. Now, there will be proximate daimonical souls. The daimons are a rank of souls above mortal souls, and so the partial intellect intellect is above daimons, of course. It's second hypostasis, not third hypostasis. So because we're mortal souls, the partial intellect that we participate of, there will also be a smaller number of daimonical souls that more directly participate of that partial intellect. So these daimonical souls may perpetually energize in conjunction with partial intellect, whereas we will sometimes energize with the partial intellect that we're connected to. And as in the Phaedrus, Plato calls this the governor of the soul. The partial intellect is the governor of the soul, and says that it alone intellectually perceives real being. Yeah, our partial intellect, that's like as far as our epistemological faculties go, except for the one of the soul, which is inspired in various kind of entheastic states. But as far as our knowledge, properly speaking, the partial intellect that we're coordinate with is kind of the highest it goes. That alone in us perceives real being. But that the soul... So, yeah, I mean, in the Phaedrus, it seems like Plato is describing a state where we make contact with the intellect, and that's by the intellect alone. So it's like we kind of move above our soul activity and just energize with the intellect, but that's a very exceptional state. But that the soul perceives it together with this intellect when she is nourished by intellect and science. So discursive rational reasoning can, in conjunction with the partial intellect, grasp something of the real beings, but it's not that highest, most direct intuitive revelation of the nature of the forms that occurs through our partial intellect itself. Thus also it must be said that this intelligence is prior to soul and is truly that intelligence mentioned by Plato, but that it is participated by soul when reason energizes intellectually. Hence, Plato says in the following part of this dialogue that intellect is indeed in the gods, but that a certain small genus of men participates of it. Interesting. And it seems, which, makes sense, there are more souls than intellects, and not every soul will be directly coordinate with an intellect, presumably. Or maybe this is kind of hyperbole, like all human souls probably do participate of some partial intellect to some degree, but maybe not all of them actively participate of it, is more the idea. And it seems that in what he says, unfolding the knowledge of perpetual being, he first calls it intelligence, but that we may not apprehend it to be that alone, he adds to intelligence reason, distinguishing by a transitive energy the latter from the former. Right, so he mentions intelligence and reason, again, to pinpoint that it's not just intellect, and it's not just the partial intellect, but it is the way that we know real beings as souls is our soul energizing with the partial intellect that we're attached to. So that when reason intellectually perceives perpetual being, as reason indeed, it energizes transitively, but as perceiving intellectually with simplicity. Understanding, so we comprehend the eternal beings in both ways, so rationally and transitively or discursively, and then also unitively in intellect. Understanding each thing as simple at once, yet not all things at once, but passing from some to others. It transitively, however, perceives intellectually everything which it perceives as one thing and as simple. So when our intellectual faculty is exercised, it has properties belonging to discursive reason as well as properties belonging to intellect. So as opposed to pure discursive reason, this intellectual energy comprehends essences in their simplicity. So it's a kind of unitive, intellectual, intuitive act compared to discursive, stepwise operations of reason, strictly speaking. And then it also, though, does contain elements of discursive reason in that we go from one intuitive apprehension of a form to another intuitive apprehension of a form. And we differentiate out the forms and aspectualize intellect itself through our discursive approach. So rather than all forms eternally energizing together with every intellectual act, instead, mediated through soul, we can aspectualize all the forms and look at one in isolation at a time. Which is something that wouldn't happen in the second hypostasis itself, because the second hypostasis is eternal, so there's no time to move between one isolated form and then another isolated form. Instead, all the forms, independent of space and time, and space is like that principle of differentiation as well as time in some respect, so they have to always energize fully together. Okay. So it transitively, however, perceives intellectually everything which it perceives as one thing and is simple, but transitively in turn. After the definition of intelligence, however, let us see what reason is and how it is connascent with intelligence. In the Theaetetus, therefore, logos, reason, is said to have a threefold subsistence, for it is either enunciative or a discursive procession through the elements of speech, or that which exhibits the differences of each thing with respect to others. So logos is enunciative or discursive, or it exhibits the differences of each thing. Okay. All these significations, however, are conversant with compositions and divisions, and are unadapted to the comprehension of eternal being. I was hoping he would elaborate that threefold division. But enunciative reason, you would expect reason as just like laying out, here is a thing. That's part of reason. Laying out, like, here's a tree, enunciating the tree. And then a discursive process through the elements of speech. So there is the tree is standing there. I guess that's one element of logos, the discursive procession through the grammatical elements of the sentence. Or that which exhibits the differences of each thing with respect to others. So you can say a tree belongs to this class and shares in this genus, but is different from a bush in that it has this differentia. So that's the third function. That's more like the analytical, kind of philosophical aspect, I suppose, of logos. But that's all proper. These operations are proper to composite entities and not the treatment of intelligible natures. For the similar is naturally adapted to be apprehended by the similar. So what is naturally apprehended by discursive reason is itself temporal. But eternal being is simple and indivisible and is exempt from everything which is contrary to these. So being simple, it's exempt from multiplicity, and it's exempt from division. Again, after another manner, one kind of reason is said to be doxastic, another scientific, and another intellectual. So scientific reason is like reason at its proper level. Opinion is reason mixed with sense, And then intellectual reason is reason mixed with intellect. For since there are in us opinion, dianoia, and intellect, but I can call intellect here the summit of dianoia, and since the whole of our essence is reason, in each of these reason must be differently surveyed. So we have these three faculties, and reason differentiates itself according to the objects concerned. So reason of sensibles, opinion, reason of reason, dianoia, reason of intelligibles, intellect. Opinion, however, is not naturally adapted to be united to the intelligence of intellect in energy. For, on the contrary, it is conjoined to irrational knowledge. Nor is dianoia, so far as it proceeds into multitude and division, able to recur to intellect, but on the contrary, through the variety of its discursive energies, it is separated from intellectual impartibility. Nor is dianoia, so far as it proceeds into multitude and division, able to recur to intellect, but on the contrary, through the variety of its discursive energies, it is separated from intellectual impartibility. Right. Okay. So opinion as reason. So the first two faculties, reason of sensibles, is not fit to join with intellect. Reason of rational things is not fit because it has partibility and separation. So it remains, therefore, that the summit of the soul, and that in it which has most the form of the one, is established in the intelligence of a partial intellect, being through alliance united to it. All right. Interesting that he calls this the summit of the soul. Hermias, a exact contemporary of Proclus, talks about the one of the soul as distinct from the partial intellect. But if you read a lot of Proclus, you will see that sometimes he glosses doctrines and abbreviates things, and then in other places will draw them out more specifically. So he says here that the summit of the soul, the thing that has most the form of the one, is established in the intelligence of a partial intellect. And maybe that term established in the intelligence of a partial intellect rather than just being a partial intellect simply is important, because that way we can say the henad of the soul and the partial intellect that the soul is conjoined to are distinct things, and yet that henad of the soul is most directly in that partial intellect. It's established in the intelligence of a partial intellect, that summit of the soul being through an alliance united to it. Hence, this is the reason which intellectually perceives the intelligibles coordinate to our nature, and the energy of which Socrates in the Republic says is intelligence. So that higher form of reason is the true intelligence, Socrates says in the Republic. Just as dianoia is the knowledge of things which subsist between intelligibles and the objects of opinion. So intelligibles are eternal, objects of opinion are sensual or sensible. Dianoia is the knowledge of things which have change and time but aren't sensible. So that would be like mathematical operations. If, however, or music, or even like moral decision-making, moral deliberation, if, however, intelligence is the energy of this reason, it will be a certain intellect. Okay, so we can call it an intellect in a certain regard if intelligence is the energy, the way that this reason energizes is according to intelligence, then it can be said to be a certain intellect. So that aspect of our discursive reason which energizes coordinate with our partial intellect can be said itself to be a certain intellect. Plato, in the following part of this dialogue, says that this reason, in the same manner as science, is ingenerated in the soul when it is moved about the intelligible. But that science has a more various energy, apprehending some things through others, and intellect, a more simple energy, intuitively surveying beings themselves. Right, so that science, or the energizing of discursive reason with partial intellect, that intelligence has a more various energy, apprehending some things relative to others as spectualizing things. Intellect, strictly speaking or properly speaking, is more simple and intuitively surveys beings themselves, not through other things. It's not a through thinking at all, it's just nous. This highest, therefore, and most impartible portion of our nature, Plato now denominates reason as unfolding to us intellect and an intelligible nature. So the highest aspect of reason that we have access to coordinates its activity with the partial intellect in us, and that he's going to call reason, strictly speaking. It's a general principle of interpretation in Plato that when Plato talks about any concept, he doesn't just mean the widest sense generally, he's going to mean the most exemplary, highest level of whatever he's talking about. Just like when Socrates comes up with an example to illustrate anything, he's going to come up with the noblest example he can. I think Proclus says that in his commentary on the first Alcibiades. For when the soul abandons fantasy and opinion and various and indefinite knowledge, but recurs to its own impartibility, according to which it is rooted in a partial intellect, and having run back to this, conjoins the energy of itself with the intelligence of that intellect, then it intellectually perceives eternal being together with it, its energy being both one and twofold, and both sameness and separation being inherent in its intellections. So that's why intelligence and reason. For then the intelligence of the soul becomes more collected and nearer to eternal things, in order that it may apprehend the intelligible together with intellect, and that the reason which is in us may, like a less light, energize in conjunction with one that is greater. For our reason, in conjunction with intelligence, sees the intelligible, but the intelligence of intellect always sees it, and always is, and conjoins reason to it when reason acquires the form of intellect. After what manner, however, is truly existing being comprehended by a partial intellect or by reason? For this is still more admirable. May we not say that though the intelligible itself cannot be comprehended by intellect and reason, so that is like the intellect that we have access to, because it is superior to all comprehension and comprehends all things exemply, transcendently, yet intellect, possessing its own intelligible, is also on this account said to comprehend the whole of an intelligible nature. So the partial intellect contains intelligibles, all contains all but appropriately in each, remember? So intelligibles contain intellectuals, intelligibly, intellectual and intelligibles contain the intelligibles, intelligibly and intellectually, and they contain intellectuals intelligibly and intellectually. Intellectuals contain the higher two categories intellectually. So in that way then here intellect possesses its own intelligible, so the intelligibles are in even a partial intellect, partially and intellectually, and yet they are there in that partial intellect. And so it does have access to intelligibles, maybe not the intelligibles purely or in their own proper level, but if we have the idea that all things are in all according to each, the partial intellect will contain all the forms, or at least an image of all the forms. So on this account, it's said to comprehend the whole of an intelligible nature, because it has an intelligible nature in itself as an intellect. So it does comprehend a whole, not merely partial. It's not like it just contains some of the forms. It contains all the forms. It's a whole intelligible nature there, even in a partial intellect. But it's still like an image, not the true collection of all the forms together that's in higher intelligible natures. But reason through the intellect, which is coordinate to itself, receives the conceptions of real beings. Receiving the conceptions of real beings is thus through these said to comprehend being. Okay, so reason through its intellect, receiving the conceptions of real being is thus said to is thus through these said to comprehend being. So it's in that manner, and I think the idea that we have a conception of real beings and not the real beings itself is the same as what I was saying before, where there's an image of the intelligibles in our partial intellect. So in that sense, then, reason comprehends being. Perhaps also it signifies that reason running round the intelligible and energizing and being moved as about a center, thus surveys it. So think about, and Plotinus goes into this, the motion of the heavenly bodies in circles is an image of pure rational intelligence, always perpetually energizing, circling around the intelligible that it's coordinate with. And of course, the actual physical motions of the heavenly bodies would be that way because they are the highest of temporal beings, the younger gods, the encosmic gods, the planets, will have those motions that directly exhibit the highest attainment of reason, which is to kind of engage in this perpetual cycling around the intelligible that it's coordinate with. Intelligence indeed, knowing it intransitively and impartibly, but reason dancing, as it were, round the essence of it in a circle, and evolving the united hypostasis of it, in it of all things. Okay, so it revolves around in a circle, and it evolves or unfolds the united hypostasis that it is circling. So it aspectualizes the forms. I think that's the best way to think of the kind of logical necessity of reason. The forms are all together and all unified unless you have reason doing this dance of aspectualization and evolving the otherwise united hypostasis of intellect. So that actually went pretty fast. This was a lot of dense and good stuff. I thought it, made a lot of sense. The more time you spend with Proclus, the more sense it tends to make. So any last comments on today's reading? Okay. In the future, if anyone wants to tune in through the Jitsi call, feel free to go ahead and interrupt with any interjection, comment, question. I know a lot of this is like we're just reading these walls of text, and it's a lot of like really dense stuff, so it might be hard to like grab on at any one particular place. But I do just want to encourage, questions, comments are welcome. But we'll do that next time. And thanks you guys for participating. Thanks everyone for listening. Take care.